Here is a quick rundown of some new information that's come to my attention that might actually be able to narrow down when the Exodus narrative and the Song of the Sea itself, Exodus 15, were composed. I am rushing this information out somewhat as I'm excited about it. It seems to me to be really massive and game-changing, and I'd like to get others' opinions on it as I refine the blind spots. Personally, I don't mind doing this, despite the complaints I get if I make an error in my excitement. The discussion is too valuable. This, of course, is a follow-up to my previous video on Exodus and the sage Dadhici as the model of most of Moses' narrative. I am not a biblical scholar nor a Vedic scholar, but from the outside perspective of the comparative mythologist, I think you'll want to hear what I have to say. Scholars can certainly help refine the details of what I'm pointing out. They first have to see why it can't be ignored. If Vedic comparative mythology is the direction in which the solution to this particular problem lies, and nowhere else, then scholars only focused on the Near Eastern context of the Bible will never reach it unless it is brought to their attention. A commenter on my recent video, SirFrankLloyd, brought up how the hymn about the Battle of the 10 Kings in the Rig Veda seems to parallel the parting of the Red Sea by Moses. I hadn't heard this from any scholars before, but surely someone must have noticed it at some point, right? Well, thank you to SirFrankLloyd for the suggestion, because looking at it now, it appears to me that Exodus 15 / the Song of the Sea may actually be a direct adaptation of this Rig Veda hymn in question, and I believe I can demonstrate it. This conclusion probably hasn't been drawn before because such a borrowing seems implausible without greater context, or the hymn seems not exactly similar enough to the Song of the Sea on its own. But one has to admit it is very similar, and when we look at the fuller picture, the number of total uniquely Vedic parallels to Exodus that we end up with, I think suggests that we should prefer this path of borrowing over other possibilities, i.e. directly from the Rig Veda and other Indian texts and adapted into Exodus. The chain of reasoning from this set of data that I will argue for, then, follows like this. The Song of the Sea is an adaptation of a specific Rig Veda hymn. The Rig Veda hymn in question is commemorating the most famous historical event found in the Rig Veda. Scholar Michael Witzel dates the event and the hymn to circa 1350 BCE, the Middle Rig Vedic period. We will go with this approximate date for the sake of argument, though dating itself is tricky. To pin down the exact date of the hymn's final assembled version found in the Rig Veda, you will have to ask Witzel directly, or consult the stars. Witzel says that the hymn, quote, clearly reflects a look back at the immigration of the Bharatas, composed or rather assembled during the time of the chieftain Bheda and of the grandsons of Devavat of the Sudas lineage, Paijavana, see Rigveda 7.18.22, unquote. And his quotes are taken from his 1995 article, Rigvedic History, Poets, Chieftains, and Polities. Thus, Witzel sees the hymn as being finally assembled a few generations later than the time of Vasistha and Sudas themselves, the heroes found within the battle and river crossing hymn itself. The big revelation here is that, barring a miracle, this hymn had to be adapted directly from Vedic sources into Exodus, and not from Iranic or Persian ones as I had previously contemplated. That is what the adaptation from a historically based hymn in the Rig Veda provides us. Because the historical event the hymn commemorates happened after the Indo-Iranic split of around 1800 or 1900 BCE, and is only found in the Rig Veda and Vedic commentaries like the Jaiminiya Brahmana, there would not have been a native version within the Iranic tradition, and no signs of it being borrowed into Iranic tradition can be found either. The Rig Veda and other Indian texts were only written down starting in the 4th century BCE, when writing first begins to appear in India. The rest of the Moses story, as I've shown in my Exodus video, is more or less a scene-by-scene adaptation of the story of the Vedic sage Dadhici, who is also unique to Vedic tradition and has no known direct equivalent in Iranic tradition. Please see the Exodus video on my channel for the detailed proof of this claim. As we will see, the stories of the parting and collapsing of the waters and the turning of waters to blood both come from the rivalry of the same sages, Vasistha and Vishvamitra, while almost everything else in Moses' story comes from sage Dadhici. So these were simply combined to make the Moses story as we know it. The fact that both main sources of the Moses story are found in Vedic sources and nowhere else is further support for the idea that the Moses story was copied directly from Indian sources rather than Iranic. Though some miraculous untraceable borrowing through Iranic intermediaries can never be ruled out, and I'm always open to possibilities, the fact has to be confronted that there is in fact zero trace of any possible similar or intermediate myths of these specific types in known Iranic sources. Vasistha and Vishvamitra are historical figures or pseudo-historical and unique to Rig Vedic tradition, while Dadhici is apparently mythical but also uniquely found in Rig Vedic tradition with no known Iranic counterpart with similar mythos. Even in European branches where the Daksha sacrifice myth, which became the golden calf sacrifice of Exodus, is paralleled, as in the story of Frigg and her servant, or that of Fionn and the man in the tree, or that of Actaeon and Artemis, no equivalent Dadhici figure appears, suggesting that he may have been a unique Vedic development. If Indian sources weren't written down till after 400 BCE, then almost the only opportunity for them to be used as the basis of Exodus would be at the Library of Alexandria. If this is true, it almost proves the necessity of the composition of Exodus at the Library of Alexandria in the 3rd century BCE, since where else could copies of Vedic texts be brought together and used for composition post 400 BCE and before the Septuagint creation in the 3rd century BCE? The fact that the Song of the Sea seems to be an adaptation from this specific historical Rig Veda hymn changes the parameters of the dating question entirely. The hymn the Song of the Sea is apparently adapted from is Rig Veda 7.18. In this hymn, King Sudas's sage Vasistha dramatically prays to Indra, and Indra makes the river Parushni shallow enough to walk over for him and King Sudas's army. Indra then makes the river drown the enemies who are pursuing and wishing to plunder King Sudas and his army. Scholars such as Michael Witzel thinks this describes a natural dike breaking and the water rushing back over the pursuers, if not some kind of flash flood. This sounds similar to Moses and the Red Sea, but not exact. However, this story is part of a fuller mythos in the corpus that tells us more. Sage Vasistha's rival sage during the battle is the sage king Vishvamitra. We can see some of the back and forth of their rivalry in other Rig Veda hymns, which they are said to be authors of. An unnamed enemy of Vasistha's is also said either to curse the river or perhaps to speak boastfully when it flows over the pursuing army in the hymn in question, and that enemy may either be Vishvamitra himself or a similarly opposing singer. Michael Witzel says of the Battle of the Ten Kings that it, quote, is not mentioned by Book 3 as Vishvamitra, Book 3's author, had by then been replaced by Vasistha as the Purohita, the priest, of Sudas, the king. There is even the possibility that it was Vishvamitra who, in an act of revenge, forged the alliance against his former chief, unquote. And, quote, the crucial point is the alleged change of sides by the Purus, who were formerly allies of the Bharatas, as well as by a Brigu, who was probably Vishvamitra, a Bhrigu pupil. This event has only come down to us from a Bharata point of view, who were after all the victors. It is more likely, in fact, that it was the Bharatas who severed the alliance and struck out on their own with a new Purohita priest, Vasistha." Unquote. Schmidt and Witzel, who Jameson and Brereton cite as the main scholars who have treated the historical dimension of the hymn, also interpret the enemy priest in the battle as Vishvamitra, rendering line 8 as, quote, "As the animal victim, the wise priest, Bhrigu/Vishvamitra, lay down, receiving due respect." Unquote. Jameson and Brereton themselves say they remain agnostic on the identity of the enemy priest in the hymn, pointing out that he has, at least temporarily, been felled in the battle here, becoming like a sacrificial animal. Regardless, Vasistha and Vishvamitra's feud is told in a fuller version in the Mahabharata, and there Vasistha prays to the river Saraswati to carry him to safety, out of reach of Vishvamitra, who is trying to kill him. In response, Vishvamitra curses the river to turn to blood, perhaps echoing the unnamed enemy of Vasistha who cursed or boasted to the river in the Rig Veda hymn version. Vishvamitra also uses a demon to kill Vasistha's 100 sons in this Mahabharata version. Vishvamitra turning the river to blood is found in Mahabharata Shalya Parva, section 42. The killing of Vasistha's sons is found in Mahabharata Chaitra Ratha Parva, section 178. And in the same section, the hostilities are sparked when the king unjustly whips a son of Vasistha, and the son curses the king in turn. Again, extremely reminiscent of the trigger of conflict in the Moses and Pharaoh story, where Moses kills an Egyptian for beating a Hebrew and then has to flee in turn. This event leads Vishvamitra to kill all of Vasistha's sons by means of a demon in response, reminiscent of the killing of all firstborn sons in the Egyptian plagues. So we have, connected to the same two feuding sages, the making shallow of the water and then drowning the pursuing enemy event, and the turning of a body of water to blood, connected to the same feuding sages in the tradition. Is this a coincidence? And with roots in a historical event or hymn from circa 1350 BCE, and the killing of the opponent's sons by a demon as additional material connected to this very feud, triggered by an unjust whipping and retaliation scene. This is, incredibly, all part of one mythos within the Vedic and post-Vedic tradition, tied to these two specific sages. This fact, of course, made me want to compare the Rig Veda hymn to the Song of the Sea itself in terms of language. On closer analysis, it turns out that the Rig Veda hymn has the same basic structure as the Song of the Sea, but even more, the Song of the Sea uses phrases and images that in numerous cases look like almost direct translations of the images and phrases in the Rig Veda hymn. Thus, the Song of the Sea must be a simplified adaptation of the Rig Veda hymn. To recap, the Rig Veda hymn 7.18 describes how the rishi Vasistha prays to Indra. He makes the river Parushni shallow to walk over for King Sudas and his army. Then Indra causes the river to flow over the pursuing enemies and drown them. The enemy of Sudas and Vasistha is also said in the hymn to curse or boast over the river for this. Vasistha was legendarily known to be in a feud with Sage King Vishvamitra, a story told in the epics and Puranas. Vishvamitra was the rishi of King Sudas and then was apparently replaced by Vasistha, which we can see in the authorship of hymns in Rigveda Book 3 praising Sudas and composed by Vishvamitra, and then hymns in Book 7 addressed to Sudas and composed by Vasistha. Hermann Oldenburg has also argued this hymn by Vasistha about the traversing and then flooding of the waters includes puns referring to Vishvamitra as the enemy, so he may or may not have been opposing Vasistha in the battle of this hymn itself. Michael Witzel, who Jamieson and Brereton cite favorably in their commentary, also suggests this was the case, although Jamieson and Brereton remain agnostic. The overall conflict of Vasistha and Vishvamitra then is reflected in the later Mahabharata version where Vasistha prays to the river Saraswati, and it carries him away to safety, causing Vishvamitra to curse it to turn to blood. This is the only Indian waters turn to blood myth that I know of, and it just happens to be tied to the feud of the sages involved in another Moses-type myth, the parting and returning of the waters. Vishvamitra also uses a demon to kill all of Vasistha's 100 sons during this same feud, similar to the killing of the firstborns of the Egyptians. So not only do we have a sage leading his people across waters made shallow, and then having the waters drown the pursuers in the Rig Veda itself, with the enemy cursing the river, but then it is this very same sage who is in the feud where the waters are turned to blood, but by his enemy's curse in this case. Parting the waters and turning the waters to blood attached to the same sage, Vasistha, with one of the events being a historical event in the Rig Veda, and the cursing of the river by his enemy also possibly being mentioned, but more vaguely, in the Rig Veda hymn. Scholar Michael Witzel calls the battle described in Rig Veda hymn 7.18, quote, the most prominent historical event recorded in the Rig Veda, the Battle of the 10 Kings, which followed the ouster of the Bharata Purohita or priest Vishvamitra, who was replaced by Vasistha, and the breaking away of the Bharata from their former Puru allies. Books 3 and particularly 7 detail the ultimate victory of the Bharatas over the other tribes, eventually including the Purus and their probable Ikvaku subtribe, and their settlement on the Sarasvati, which became the heartland of South Asia well into the Vedic period, unquote, and concludes that, quote, the Rig Veda thus represents, above all, the history of two royal lineages, Puru and Bharata, towards the middle of the Rig Vedic period, unquote. The framing of the battle is even eerily similar to that of the Exodus, a movement from out of a distant country, here Iran, according to Witzel's interpretation of the evidence, and into a sort of promised land in the Indian subcontinent, where Sudas and his clan become the rulers, an ultimate dominion they ask Indra to bless in the hymn in question. As Witzel states, quote, the whole process refers to the origins of the Bharatas and Vasistha in eastern Iran. Their move into the subcontinent is also reflected elsewhere in Book 7, 7.5.3 and 6, and summed up in 7.33.3, unquote. And further along, quote, the entire Book 7 is thus a snapshot of history. The incursion of the Bharata into the Punjab from across the Sindhu, and their battle with the 5 peoples and the Puru. It celebrates the victory of Sudas in the Battle of the 10 Kings, which once and for all established Bharata's supremacy in the Punjab, and set the stage for the formation of the first South Asian state under the Kuru tribe, unquote. The main event of the Battle of the 10 Kings in hymn 7.18 is described as happening on the Parushni River, which is the modern Ravi in Pakistan. Therefore, did the Exodus happen in the Punjab? Jamieson and Brereton caution us to not take the history recorded in the hymn too literally, saying, quote, the hymn has long been used as a major source for the reconstruction of Rigvedic history, perhaps somewhat too credulously, as the description of the battle is anything but clear and is also clearly full of puns, unquote, from their Rigveda translation, page 903, while Hermann Oldenburg notes that no distinction between historical events and mythology existed for the Vedic poets. Indeed, we should keep in mind that the poets wrapped events in myth and pre-existing formulae as soon as they occurred, This was their job, and so discerning what is historical and what is mythical is almost an impossible task. However, the Battle of the Ten Kings as a whole had measurable, even massive repercussions in the region, and no event just like the one in this hymn is found in the Vedic or Avestan corpus. So even if it is dressed in mythic forms, the hymn seems to have a recognizable historical nucleus, unique details in its scenario, and a composition date placing it in the Rigvedic period. Now, let's look at the Song of the Sea and Rigveda 7.18 in full, back to back, and note the similarities. As you will see, they even follow the same basic structure, something like this. I sing to my God, he is exalted/mighty/wealthy. We walked across the body of water that was made like land or shallow. Then the pursuing enemies were drowned in it by the power of our God. The enemies were trying to pursue us and specifically wanted to plunder us. A quotation of the enemies speaking their thoughts occurs about this same point in both hymns. Both pieces of dialogue include the same content too, the enemies mentioning aloud their desire for plunder. Next, our God drowned them very easily, like a metaphor for something very easily done, specifically like cutting or burning away grass or straw. Then, list of several named opponent chiefs that the god has struck fear into or struck down. Ending with further glorification of the god and asking to ensure the future dominion of the poet and his associates. With this framework in mind, let's quickly read the hymns, and then break them down into specific matching sections and phrases. I'll be using Griffith's translation for the Vedic hymn, and bringing in Jameson and Brereton's translation when we need to zoom in on exact wording. Rigveda 7.18, quote, All is with thee, O Indra, all the treasures which erst our fathers won, who sang thy praises. With thee are milch kine, good to milk, and horses, best winner thou of riches for the pious. For like a king among his wives, thou dwellest, with glories as a sage, surround and help us. Make us, thy servants, strong for wealth, and honor our songs with kine and steeds and decoration. Hear these our holy hymns with joy and gladness, in pious emulation have approached thee. Hitherward come thy path that leads to riches. May we find shelter in thy favor, Indra. Vasistha hath poured forth his prayers, desiring to milk thee like a cow in goodly pasture. All these my people call thee Lord of cattle. May Indra come unto the prayer we offer. What though the floods spread widely? Indra made them shallow and easy for Sudas to traverse. He, worthy of our praises, caused the Simeu, foe of our hymn, to curse the river's fury. Eager for spoil was Turvasa, Purodas, fain to win wealth, like fishes urged by hunger. The Brigus and the Druyus quickly listened. Friend rescued friend mid the two distant peoples. Together came the Pakthas, the Bahalanas, the Alinas, the Sivas, the Visanins. Yet to the Tritsus came the Aryas, Indra's comrade, that is us, through love of spoil and heroes' war to lead them. Fools in their folly, fain to waste her waters, they parted inexhaustible Parushni, the river. Lord of the earth, he with his might repressed them. Still lay the herd and the affrighted herdsmen. As to their goal they sped to their destruction. They sought Parushni, even the swift returned not. Indra abandoned to Sudas, the manly, the swiftly flying foes, unmanly babblers. They went like kine unherded from the pasture, each clinging to a friend as chance directed. They who drive spotted steeds, sent down by Prishni, gave ear, the warriors and the harnessed horses. The king who scattered 21 people of both Vaikarna tribes through lust of glory, as the skilled priest, or literally wonder worker, clips grass within the chamber, so hath the hero Indra wrought their downfall. Thou, thunder-armed, overwhelmedst in the waters famed ancient Kavasa, and then Druhyu. Others here claiming friendship to their friendship, devoted unto thee, in thee were joyful. Indra at once with conquering might demolished all their strong places and their 7 castles. The goods of Anu's son he gave to Tritsu. May we in sacrifice conquer scorned Puru. The Anavas and Druhyus seeking booty have slept, the 600, yea, 6,066 heroes. For the pious were all these mighty exploits done by Indra. These Tritsus, under Indra's careful guidance, came speeding like loosed waters rushing downward. The foemen, measuring exceeding closely, abandoned to Sudas all their provisions. The heroes sighed who drank the dressed oblation, Indra's denier, far o'er the earth he scattered. Indra brought down the fierce destroyer's fury. He gave them various roads, the path's controller. E'en with the weak he wrought this matchless exploit. E'en with a goat he did to death a lion. He pared the pillar's angles with a needle. Thus to Sudas Indra gave all provisions. To thee have all thine enemies submitted. E'en the fierce Veda hast thou made thy subject. Cast down thy sharpened thunderbolt, O Indra, on him who harms the men who sing thy praises. Yamuna and the Tritsus aided Indra. There he stripped Veda bare of all his treasures. The Ajas and the Sigrus and the Yaksus brought in to him as tribute heads of horses, not to be scorned, but like dawns past and recent, O Indra, are thy favors and thy riches. Devaka, Manyamana's son, thou slewest and smotest Shambhara from the lofty mountain. They who from home have gladdened thee, thy servants, Parasara, Vasistha, Satayatu, will not forget thy friendship, liberal giver. So shall the dawns dawn prosperous for the princes. Priest-like, with praise, I move around the altar, earning Paijavana's, that is, Sudas's, reward. O Agni, 200 cows from Devanan's descendant, 2 chariots from Sudas, with mares to draw them. Gift of Paijavana, that is Sudas, 4 horses bear me in foremost place, trained steeds with pearl to deck them. Sudas's brown steeds, firmly stepping, carry me and my son for progeny and glory. Him whose fame spreads between wide earth and heaven, who as dispenser gives each chief his portion, 7 flowing rivers glorify like Indra. He slew Udyamadi in close encounter. Attend on him, O ye heroic Maruts, as on Sudas's father, Divodasa. Further Paijavana's, that is Sudas's, desire with favor. Guard faithfully his lasting, firm dominion. Unquote. And Exodus 15, the Song of the Sea. Quote, I will sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. Both horse and driver he has hurled into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my defense. He has become my salvation. He is my God, and I will praise him, my father's God, and I will exalt him. The Lord is a warrior. The Lord is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his army he has hurled into the sea. The best of Pharaoh's officers are drowned in the Red Sea. The deep waters have covered them. They sank to the depths like a stone. Your right hand, Lord, was majestic in power. Your right hand, Lord, shattered the enemy. In the greatness of your majesty, you threw down those who opposed you. You unleashed your burning anger. It consumed them like stubble. By the blast of your nostrils, the waters piled up. The surging waters stood up like a wall or heap. The deep waters congealed in the heart of the sea. The enemy boasted, I will pursue, I will overtake them, I will divide the spoils, I will gorge myself on them, I will draw my sword, and my hand will destroy them. But you blew with your breath, and the sea covered them. They sank like lead in the mighty waters. Who among the gods is like you, Lord? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glory, working wonders? You stretch out your right hand, and the earth swallows your enemies. In your unfailing love, you will lead the people you have redeemed. In your strength, you will guide them to your holy dwelling. The nations will hear and tremble. Anguish will grip the people of Philistia. The chiefs of Edom will be terrified. The leaders of Moab will be seized with trembling. The people of Canaan will melt away. Terror and dread will fall on them. By the power of your arm, they will be as still as a stone. Until your people pass by, Lord. Until the people you bought pass by. You will bring them in and plant them on the mountain of your inheritance, the place, Lord, you made for your dwelling, the sanctuary, Lord, your hands established. The Lord reigns forever and ever. When Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and horsemen went into the sea, the Lord brought the waters of the sea back over them, but the Israelites walked through the sea on dry ground. As we can see, the Song of the Sea should be read as a simplified version of the more complicated Rig Veda hymn, which is admittedly older. Like the biblical adapters have boiled down each section of the Vedic hymn to produce their version. Despite this boiling down, we still have numerous similar phrases. Let's go through them now. 1. Number 1 can be summarized as, God's strong arm drowned the enemy leaders, making them unmoving for God's devoted people. The strong arm of God is extremely generic in such hymns, but if it was absent, that would be telling, especially since it is one of the main images in the succinct Exodus song. Thus we should note that it is where we would expect it in the Vedic hymn. Rigveda 7.18.12 reads, quote, Thou, thunder-armed or mace-armed, overwhelmedst in the waters famed ancient Kavasa, and then the Druhyu, others here claiming friendship to their friendship, devoted unto thee, in thee were joyful. Indra at once with conquering might demolished all their strong places and their 7 castles. The gods of Anu's son he gave to Tritsu. May we in sacrifice conquer scorned Puru. The Anavas and Druhyus, seeking booty, have slept. The 6,000, yea 6,066 heroes, for the pious were all these mighty exploits done by Indra. This equals Exodus 15:4-6. Quote, The best of Pharaoh's officers are drowned in the Red Sea. The deep waters have covered them. They sank to the depths like a stone. Your right hand, Lord, was majestic in power. Your right hand, Lord, shattered the enemy. Unquote. And it is also comparable to, quote, By the power of your arm, they will be as still as a stone, until your people pass by, Lord, until the people you bought pass by, unquote. 2. Number 2, specific named enemy tribes have been struck down / terrified. Rigveda 7.18.18-20 reads, quote, To thee have all thine enemies submitted. E'en the fierce Veda hast thou made thy subject. Cast down thy sharpened thunderbolt, O Indra, on him who harms the men who sing thy praises. Yamuna and the Tritsus aided Indra. There he stripped Veda bare of all his treasures. The Ajas and the Sigrus and the Yaksus brought in to him as tribute heads of horses. Not to be scorned, but like dawns past and recent are thy favors and thy riches. Devaka, Manyamana's son, thou slewest, and smotest Shambhara from the lofty mountain. Unquote. This equals Exodus 15:14-16, which reads, quote, In your unfailing love you will lead the people you have redeemed. In your strength you will guide them to your holy dwelling. The nations will hear and tremble. Anguish will grip the people of Philistia. The chiefs of Edom will be terrified. The leaders of Moab will be seized with trembling. The people of Canaan will melt away. Terror and dread will fall on them. Unquote. 3. Number 3 can be roughly summarized as, Your act of destruction has killed them easily, like straw or grass. Rigveda 7.18.11 in Jameson and Brereton's translation reads, quote, "He who as king, with desire for fame, has strewn down the 21 peoples of the 2 Vaikarnas, just as a wonder worker wets down, that is, cuts, the ritual grass on the seat. The champion Indra made a gush of them." Unquote. This equals Exodus 15.7. Quote, "You unleashed your burning anger. It consumed them like stubble/straw." Unquote. Stubble and straw are common translations of the word here, which is kash, Qash, referring more specifically to the stalks of grain left behind after reaping. The word in the Vedic hymn refers to the ritual grass called kusa that the priest cuts. 4. The god called a wonder worker. The just mentioned Rigveda 7.18.11 says of Indra's act, quote, "just as a wonder worker," unquote. This directly equals Exodus 15.11, quote, "Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glory, working wonders," unquote. Though it's not unheard of to use this phrase of a god, it is nonetheless a more rare phrase than the invocation of God's strong arm, so its value for comparison shouldn't be overlooked among the other similarities, especially since there are very few figures of speech in the Exodus song to begin with. And this one stands out. The Sanskrit word used is dasma, D-A-S-M-A-H, with dot below, meaning literally to work wonders. 5. Lord of the earth, and scattered across or swallowed by the earth. This one may be more of a coincidence, but should be included in a consideration of all coincidental language, which does add up. Rigveda 7.18.8 reads, quote, "Lord of the earth, he with his might repressed them, still lay the herd and the affrighted herdsmen. As to their goal, they sped to their destruction. They sought Parushni, e'en the swift returned not." Unquote. First, compare this to Joshua 3:11-13, which has been seen as an echo of Moses' crossing of the Red Sea. Quote, "See, the ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth will go into the Jordan ahead of you. Now then, choose 12 men from the tribes of Israel, one from each tribe, and as soon as the priests who carry the ark of the Lord of all the earth, set foot in the Jordan, its waters flowing downstream will be cut off and stand up in a heap." Unquote. Or see Rigveda 7.18.16, which reads, quote, "The heroes side who drank the dressed oblation, Indra's denier, far o'er the earth he scattered. Indra brought down the fierce destroyer's fury." Compare these two passages to Exodus 15.12, quote, "You stretch out your right hand, and the earth swallows your enemies." Unquote. Again, this one can be a loose coincidence and goes along with the other images of Indra destroying the fortifications and armies of the enemy tribes, but it contributes to the concept of similar imagery being used in both hymns, as well as in the echo found in Joshua, referring to a Lord of the earth. It's easy to imagine that someone translating Sanskrit into Hebrew might have translated a phrase meaning, "He scattered them over the earth," to, "You make the earth swallow them," though we can of course only speculate on this. 6. Number 6 can be summarized as, God set up or knocked down from the high mountain. That is, the usage of the high mountain as a metaphorical image symbolizing the same thing in both cases. Rigveda 7.18.20 reads, quote, "Devaka, Manyamana's son thou slewest and smotest Shambhara from the lofty mountain." Unquote. Or look at the image of Indra giving Sudas lasting dominion in Rigveda 7.18.23-25, quote, "Sudas's brown steeds, firmly stepping, carry me and my son for progeny and glory. Attend on him, O ye heroic Maruts, as on Sudas's father Divodasa. Further Paijavana's desire with favor." guard faithfully his lasting, firm dominion, unquote. Compare both of these images of Indra knocking foes down from the lofty mountain and setting up the dominion of Sudas to Exodus 15.3 and 17, which combines these, having God set up his people for their dwelling upon the mountain of their inheritance. Quote, "In your unfailing love, you will lead the people you have redeemed. In your strength, you will guide them to your holy dwelling," unquote. And, quote, "You will bring them in and plant them on the mountain of your inheritance, the place, Lord, you made for your dwelling, the sanctuary, Lord, your hands established," unquote. 7. The warriors and the horses. From Rigveda 7.18.10 in Griffith's translation reads, quote, "They who drive spotted steeds, sent down by Prishni, gave ear, the warriors and the harnessed horses." And Jameson and Brereton's translation of the same verse gives us, quote, "They went like cows without a cowherd, the Prishnigus," a tribe name or referring to ones who drive dappled cattle, "propelled down to the dappled one, Parushni, the river. The teams and the battlers followed orders." This is an image telling of the enemies being sent down to drown by Prishni, which Jameson says is a pun on Parushni, the river, and concluding with a phrase translated here as, "the warriors and the harnessed horses," and "the teams and the battlers followed orders." This then appears almost directly translated into Exodus 15.1 and 4. Quote, "I will sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. Both horse and driver he has hurled into the sea," unquote. And, quote, "Pharaoh's chariots and his army he has hurled into the sea," unquote. This is one of the most haunting phrases of the Song of the Sea, both horse and driver, and it appears to be directly prefigured in the Rig Veda hymn. 8. Enemies became like flotsam or a stone in the waters. Rigveda 7.8.5 in Jameson and Brereton's translation reads, quote, "Even the floods that had spread out, Indra made them into fords easy to cross for Sudas. Simyu, who was vaunting himself above our newer speech, he, Indra, made him into the flotsam of the rivers, and his taunts too." Unquote. This, of course, equals the postscript to the song, Exodus 15.19. Quote, "When Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and horsemen went into the sea, the Lord brought the waters of the sea back over them, but the Israelites walked through the sea on dry ground." Unquote. And also Exodus 15.5 and 8. Quote, "The deep waters have covered them. They sank to the depths like a stone." Unquote. And, quote, "The surging waters stood up like a wall or heap." Unquote. Where the Vedic image of the enemy becoming like flotsam in the waters has turned into the enemy becoming like a stone in the waters, and the spread out floods made into fords of the Vedic hymn has become the waters piled up like a heap. Jameson and Brereton follow Schmidt and Oldenburg in translating this verse with the word flotsam. But Griffith does not include this in his translation. Thus, there are translation issues here due to complicated word order and other plays on words, but several prominent scholars translate it thus, as flotsam. I don't consider this a load-bearing detail in the comparison, but it can add or subtract from the overall list, depending which translation is followed. 9. Friendship or love of the god. Rigveda 7.18.21 reads, quote, "They who, from home, have gladdened thee, thy servants, Parasara, Vasistha, Satayatu, will not forget thy friendship, liberal giver. So shall the days dawn prosperous for the princes." Unquote. This is similar to Exodus 15.13, quote, "In your unfailing love, you will lead the people you have redeemed. In your strength, you will guide them to your holy dwelling." Unquote. These are generic references to friendship and love of the deity found in many hymns, but they contribute to the claim that the tone and the depiction of the god's attitude is about the same in both of these hymns. This underlines the lack of contradiction between the hymns in their overall depictions of the god and his connection to his preferred people who he is saving from the waters in both hymns. 10. A piece of spoken dialogue appearing in about the same place in both hymns, specifically of the enemies mentioning their desire for plunder. Rigveda 7.18.7 reads, quote, "The feasting companion of the Arya, that is Indra, who led us hither with desire for cattle, for the Tritsus he has gone with battle against superior men, that is us." Unquote. Exodus 15 verse 9 reads, quote, "The enemy boasted, I will pursue, I will overtake them, I will divide the spoils, I will gorge myself on them." Unquote. 11. The greed for plunder of the pursuing enemies being described as hunger or eating. Rigveda 7.18.6 reads, quote, "Eager for spoil was Turvasa Purodas, fain to win wealth, like fishes urged by hunger." Unquote. And as just mentioned, Exodus 15:9 has the greedy pursuers saying, quote, "I will gorge myself on them." Unquote. Thus, both hymns use either hunger or eating, gorging, as the image here. There are only 18 verses in the Song of the Sea proper, and a limited number of relatively unique phrases and images in it. A majority of the relatively unique phrases and images in the song are either similar or dramatically close to phrases already found in Rigveda 7.18, which also has the same overall structure and uncannily similar main event. There is simply not very much that is unique to the Exodus song when compared to the earlier Rigveda hymn, and the Exodus song poet just happened to choose most of the same images as the Vedic hymn while telling nearly the same story. If a Christian apologist found this hymn dated to around 1350 BCE and given credence by serious historians, and it was written in Hebrew to Yahweh, they would be ecstatic with how it proves the historical basis of the Exodus event. Be honest about this. Except that it is written in Sanskrit, happened in the Punjab to Vedic people, and by the power of Indra. Each one of these similar phrases can be picked apart and discarded by a skeptical critic if they desire to, but this is not a one-pointed argument. This argument involves three main pillars. The main event of the hymn being uncannily similar to begin with. The fact that the same feuding sages are the ones who turn a body of water to blood in the same tradition. And then on top of these, the fact that both structure and phrasings between the two hymns are extremely similar. More similar than any other like hymns in the genre, as we will see. The fourth point for further support is the fact, demonstrated in my previous video, that the rest of Moses' story also shows borrowing from a uniquely Rigvedic figure, Dadhici, supporting the idea that all arrows point to the Rig Veda, and the entire Moses story was composed from Vedic elements in a single act of composition. Adding these points together, the degree of coincidence crosses the line into the unbelievable. It is no coincidence. The greater context of the hymn's author, Vasistha, having the river turned to blood by his rival in the feud with him, and also Moses precisely paralleling Dadhici in the rest of his story, finally gives enough context to how this Vedic hymn must have been borrowed and adapted by the biblical authors, despite the difficulties in the logistics of how this may have happened. Absent this context, the Rig Veda hymn has previously appeared an isolated item with a similarity that didn't require explaining, not enough to suggest a strong connection. But in context with the other uncanny pieces, we now see this Rig Veda hymn must have been the source of a direct borrowing into Exodus, and the opportunity was certainly there at the Great Library or a similar occasion. Now, opponents will surely react to this by falling back on the idea that this is only a shared genre of religious hymn, a crossing of the river genre that is drawing from similar generic themes and images. It's true that the crossing of the river hymn is a genre, and it seems obvious that any river crossing would have been a great opportunity for such religious hymns. There must have been a stock model for the hymn type going back even to Indo-Iranic or even into unknown prehistory. We can see this because we have examples of the crossing of the river hymn genre in both the Iranic Avesta and in other hymns of the Rig Veda itself. It was quite popular in the Rig Veda. But because we have these to compare to, it only highlights how unique Rig Veda 7.18 is in the tradition and how coincidental the use of the same structure and phrases really is in context of the genre. These images and phrases are not equally found in all the other hymns of the genre. None of the other hymns we have tell of the relatively unique event of the waters being made shallow and then also crashing down on the pursuing enemy, as they are also thinking on plunder. This particular scenario is unique to Rig Veda 7.18 and the Song of the Sea among our available examples. None of the other examples use a similar set of phrases to that which we have listed between Rig Veda 7.18 and the Song of the Sea either. In short, genre is not the safe fallback that one might think, as it only casts into relief just how improbably similar our two examples are relative to other instances of the genre. Here for reference is a passage from the hymn to Anahita, the equivalent of Sarasvati, in the Avesta, which suggests a genre of hymn to the waters to make them passable, which goes back at least to Indo-Iranic times, prior to 1800 BCE, but notably does not describe the waters rushing back on the pursuing enemy, an event that was apparently part of the real historical happenstance of the Rig Veda hymn event. There does seem to be remnants of an Indo-Iranic genre of these river-crossing hymns based on Avestan evidence. However, the only one I could find in the Avesta is very, very different from the Vedic and Exodus hymns, so analysis of the Avestan hymn still supports the likelihood of Rig Vedic direct transmission to Exodus. Quote, Vistaru, the son of Neotara, worshipped her, Anahita, by the brink of the river Vitangu-Haiti, with well-spoken words, speaking thus, This is true, this is truly spoken, that I have smitten as many of the worshippers of the Devas as the hairs I bear on my head. Do thou then, O Ardvi Sura Anahita, leave me a dry passage to pass over the good Vitangu-Haiti. Ardvi Sura Anahita hastened unto him in the shape of a maid, fair of body, most strong, tall-formed, high-girded, pure, nobly born, of a glorious race, wearing shoes up to the ankle, with all sorts of ornaments and radiant. A part of the waters she made stand still. A part of the waters she made flow forward, and she left him a dry passage to pass over the good Vitangu-Haiti. Unquote. Not that there couldn't be a lost hymn or genre of hymns more similar to the other two hymns we have been analyzing, but nothing else in the Avesta that I'm aware of is this close to the Rig Veda hymn in question. The hymn is similar, but it only emphasizes the unique traits shared by the Rig Veda hymn and Song of the Sea, by contrast. This also serves to give an idea of what the Avestan tradition had to compare to the Song of the Sea itself, and it is nothing anywhere close to the detailed similarity of the Rig Veda hymn to the Exodus song, further pointing to the need for direct Rig Vedic adaptation and not adaptation from the available Iranic tradition. The other Rig Veda hymns in which a halted or forded river is crossed yield similar results and are 2.13.12, 2.15.5 through 6, 5.31.8, 8.19.37, and 7.33. This last one being another hymn about the Battle of 10 Kings river crossing. Nothing in these comes close to matching the specificity of hymn 7.18. So, based on the hypothesis that the biblical Song of the Sea is borrowed from a semi-historical hymn within the Rig Veda, think through this chain of deductions regarding the dating of the text. Start with the steelman assumption that the Song of the Sea is from 9th century BCE, according to Kip Davis and other mainstream scholars. But these scholars admit the Song of the Sea is very different from the supposedly later full Moses story of his wanderings and doesn't mention a Moses within the song. So they presume the full Moses wandering story, along with his name, didn't exist in the 9th century, when the Song of the Sea was written, but was added at some time later. But the Moses wandering story is the Dadhici part of the story, also borrowed from Vedic material per my previous arguments. See my Exodus video. Alternately, it would be from now completely lost Iranic material, but the rest of the Vedic connections make me extremely skeptical of this long-shot possibility now, and there are no traces of a Dadhici-like character in the Iranic material that we have. But it's very unlikely the biblical authors would have borrowed from Vedic or Indo-Iranic material at two different points in time, hundreds of years apart, into the same story. Therefore, the most likely solution is the Library of Alexandria, or something else that could accomplish the same feat in the same time period. Or the entire Moses story was borrowed all at once in the 9th century or before, but somehow wasn't reflected in detail in other corroborating texts until much later, which now also seems less plausible to me. Also, of course, the key fact that India didn't have writing in the 9th century BCE. It can't be stressed enough that the Dadhici section of the Moses myth is based on a Rudra Shiva type mythos, where Rudra Shiva is the god who destroys the illegal golden sacrifice, with Dadhici as his loyal sage who protests it. And the Rudra Shiva type god was demonized and expunged by the Zoroastrians, more or less, turning him into their great evil, Ahriman. Thus, this myth disappeared in Zoroastrian tradition, was suppressed, and is simply not an orthodox Persian mythos, but the opposite. This again points to the unlikelihood of this mythos being borrowed from Persians, who erased and demonized it, and the greater likelihood of a direct Indian borrowing. Besides composition at Alexandria from Vedic texts or ghost Iranic texts that have left no trace, the only other way these stories would have had a plausible path of transmission to Israel and the Hebrew Bible would have been by some untraced oral tradition coming ultimately from India at an unknown earlier date. However, the level of detail closely matching to the original Vedic material involved in the adaptations found in Exodus makes adaptation direct from a written source appear far more reasonable than from an oral transmission, which presents exponential difficulties, and so we have to admit that this type of oral transmission seems far more unrealistic than the available Alexandria possibility, specifically in view of the great detail and extensiveness of the borrowings. To restate this, if as many scholars suggest, the Song of the Sea is among the earliest texts in the Hebrew Bible, but does not mention Moses because his story was supposedly created later than the song and added to it, This would require two separate borrowing events from Vedic or Vedic-like sources, since these are the origins of both aspects of Exodus, supposedly years or centuries apart. A scenario of two separate borrowings from this distant source is far too implausible to really believe without evidence, and so we must conclude that the entire Exodus was most likely adapted and compiled in a single event. Therefore, there is no need or basis to posit an early date for the adaptation of the Song of the Sea, since a chronological gap between it and the rest of Exodus is not supported by the proposed model of Vedic borrowing. To put it succinctly, if the Song of the Sea is from the same time as the rest of the Exodus, then the usual narrative of gradual development that is used to explain why Moses isn't mentioned in this poem becomes unsupportable. The whole gradual development model common to biblical text criticism goes out the window, since it must have been a single borrowing of two complete narrative blocks, the Vasistha-Vishvamitra and the Dadhici blocks, smoothly combined into one by a skilled composer, but both coming from the same Vedic corpus. If there was no gradual development of the story, then the fact that Moses is not named in the Song of the Sea, but is named in the rest of the Exodus, cannot any longer be used to support any concept of two time periods for these parts of the text. All arguments for the Song of the Sea being older than the full Exodus narrative that use the absence of Moses in the song as evidence that it is an older, undeveloped version of the narrative no longer hold much water if this borrowing is true. We must conclude instead that the song simply didn't name Moses for a different literary purpose, or even to suggest archaism along with its archaizing language, not that it was written at an earlier time than when the name Moses was being attached to the narrative. The borrowing scenario makes a different age of the Song of the Sea compared to the full Exodus narrative of Moses implausible, and thus its actual archaism much more unlikely, since it must now be a borrowing from the same time as the rest of the story, and the rest of the story show signs of later composition. Lastly, we can more or less deduce why the feud of Vasistha and Vishvamitra was combined with the feud of Dadhici and King Kasuva in the composing of the story of Moses, since not only are Vasistha, Vishvamitra, and Dadhici perhaps the most prominent model sages of the Vedic corpus, but both pairs are also in very similar dramatic feuds that some texts describe as being over the very same issue. In the Ramayana telling of the feud of Vasistha and Vishvamitra, it is a dispute about whether the power of the warrior king or the sage is greater, with Vishvamitra standing for the warrior king and Vasistha as the sage. The sage Vasistha proves his power over the warrior king, making Vishvamitra convert himself to a sage in the end. The dispute of Dadhici and King Kasuva is also described as being about whether the prerogative of the king or the sage is greater, with Kasuva arguing for the king and Dadhici for the sage. Dadhici, the sage Brahmana, again wins out and humbles the king under the power of the sage. It's pretty clear how similar these two feuds are and how readily they would be combined, especially since each one contains certain memorable supernatural events which, when combined, perfectly add up to the fantastic, miracle-filled story we find in Exodus. I'll throw this to the audience, though. Can you think of a more plausible path of adaptation based on the data and the details of the Vedic sources, besides via the Library of Alexandria? It seems to me that at minimum, the Rig Veda, the Mahabharata, and a Proto-Shiva Purana or similar would have been needed by the composers of Exodus, or a very, very detailed summary of these texts or the tradition that they were part of. Does this new data support the claim that the entirety of the book of Exodus was written at the Library of Alexandria, simply by combining the myth of the sage Dadhici with a few of the motifs from the feud of sages Vasistha and Vishvamitra? I'm open-minded about wild ideas of Vedic tribes breaking off, joining the Israelites and becoming among the tribes of Israel, and perhaps bringing their religion to the Israelites until it became theirs and they took on the tradition in a natural way. But let's keep our theories within the realms of the evidence and what seems most plausible. One thing that makes this sort of idea seem less plausible to me is how freely they have conflated and combined the Vedic gods and sages, boiled things down, and the fact that they have seemed to hide the origin of this mythos by casting it as having happened in an Egyptian setting rather than where it really happened, in the Punjab. After collecting all of the alignments of Dadhici's mythos to Moses's, I had wondered where the parting of the Red Sea, turning waters to blood, and killing of Egypt's sons myths had come from, as they were the only major motifs missing from the Dadhici comparison. Now we find these exact three missing myths, all connected in the Vasistha-Vishvamitra mythos, with roots in an Exodus-like historical event preserved in the Rig Veda itself, thus fitting together with the Dadhici mythos like two halves of a broken ancient tablet. My book, Taliesin's Map, The Comparative Guide to Celtic Mythology, is available from Amazon, link in the description. Please check out my Patreon if you would like to support the channel and see all of the important topics I have in mind get made into videos, as well as supporting the completion of my second book, Briochan's Tower, in which many mysteries will be solved.